So today we're going to be making a cider starter. I've seen a lot of videos on how to make beer starters online, but none how to make cider starters, and I'm guessing that the procedure is basically the same thing. So we're just going to go over that now. I have 1 cup of water. It's been nuked in the microwave to kill any baddies for about a minute. And we're just going to go ahead and rehydrate our yeast. Yeast I'm using for this is Premier Cote de Blanc. It is a white wine yeast, has a high temperature range of about 70 degrees. But we're not going to care about that because this brew that this is being used for is for a pressure fermentation, so it doesn't really matter what the high range is for it. So we're going to go ahead and start off with rehydrating our yeast. It's been about 10 minutes. You can see the yeast starting to go ahead and release some CO2. So we know it's time to go on to our next step. Our yeast has been proofed. Now that our yeast is proofed, it's nice and bubbly, which means that the yeast has started to wake up, started to produce CO2. And that's how we know our yeast is proofed. We're going to go ahead and add the apple juice. So the important part about creating a starter is to put the yeast that you have into the solution that you intend on making. So this is actually going to be used for an imperial cider. So the reason why I'm using a yeast starter for an imperial cider is a higher alcohol volume, and it's going to have a little bit more acidity with some added citrus to it. That I really want to make sure that the yeast is getting past the lag stage and into the exponential stage of yeast growth so that it can start a really active, vigorous fermentation. It also reduces the need to add nutrient in step, in my opinion. I know that manufacturers for the yeast nutrient says to add it in steps, but if you're doing a pressurized fermentation, it can be kind of difficult to add it in steps unless you have really complicated mechanisms to deploy in there. So it's also to make it so that we get to the exponential phase before we add our yeast nutrient to our batch. So now we're just going to go ahead and prepare this solution. I'm going to go ahead and dump in here, being careful. So most store-bought cider has a specific gravity of about 1.050 to 1.052. And I say cider as in the British or the American version of cider, this cloudy beverage. Hard cider would be what the American versions call the British cider. So this solution is about ½ gallon in here. We're going to save this for brew day tomorrow and have this ready to go for that time. We're going to just go ahead and put the yeast into this cider. Once again, pouring carefully. Right. Most of that yeast has been added, and now we're going to start the fun part, and that is to shake the ever-living bejesus out of this. So, important part about starting a yeast colony is to get oxygen into the yeast. The yeast really love oxygen when they're first starting to grow, and after a certain period of time, they stop. When all the oxygen is gone from the solution, they stop producing more yeast as vigorously, and they start to use the CO2. They go from aerobic respiration to anaerobic respiration. So the beginning phases of yeast growth is always going to be aerobic respiration. So we want to make sure we have lots of oxygen in there. People go to some extremes about having like oxygen stones. I really don't think that's necessary if you can shake it. If you're like a commercial brewery and you can't shake your batch, then yeah, go ahead and do that. So that's all been combined. I'm going to go ahead and let this sit overnight. I'm not too worried about pressure building up on this because I'm going to go ahead and burp it in the morning. But this is just going to sit overnight, and we're going to go ahead and verify that we have a good yeast colony, get it past that lag phase. and into the exponential phase of yeast growth. So in the morning, you'll see what this looks like, and we'll follow back up. All right, it is the morning now, and we get to check on our yeast starter. So I already burped this morning, and by burping, you just open up the top and check to make sure that you get some CO2. We're going to go ahead and burp it now, and to give you an idea of what that should sound like opening a bottle of soda. So that's one of the primary ways we know that the fermentation in here is active. A couple things to note, that this was a pressure rated bottle. If this was not pressure rated, you would definitely want to put an airlock on the top of this. And even though it is pressure rated, you're definitely going to want to discharge some of the pressure to make sure that this bottle doesn't explode overnight. It's a short amount of time for fermentation to happen in this bottle, but it's still important to make sure that it doesn't cause a mess. But that's it. We've created a cider starter rather than a beer starter. So this is the process you want to use for creating a cider starter. The yeast have been acclimated to that pH for this environment that they're going to be in for the fermentation, and they're ready to get put into a brew that's ready to get started, and it'll reduce the lag time of the brew by probably a couple hours. So anyway, that's it. Cider starter.